Horror Nights presents 5 true scary mental asylum horror stories. Number 5. The Gatineau Vampire. On January 4, 2006, 28-year-old Richard Tracer was arrested after he broke into a home in Gatineau, Quebec, and murdered all 5 family members living in the home. While they slept, Tracer cut their jugulars and then latched onto their necks and drank their blood. When he was arrested, he said that he needed the blood or he'd wither away. Tracer had a history of mental illness and had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was supposed to be on medication, but at the time of the murder, Tracer wasn't taking it. Tracer was sent to Canada's only hospital for people who are criminally insane, the Philippe Pinel Institute in Montreal. Tracer, who came to be called the Vampire of Gatineau in the newspapers, was admitted into the hospital on June 1, 2006. Due to the barbarity of the crime, he was put into isolation, even though he was back on his medication. 5 days later, when a staff member went to serve Tracer his breakfast, she made a startling discovery. Tracer had been brutally murdered. Somehow, someone or several people got into his locked room, stabbed him in the chest, and decapitated him. Also on his forehead, a cross was burned into his flesh, and his mouth was stuffed with garlic. An autopsy was performed and Tracer had been tied to his bed, and he died from a single stab wound to the heart with a sharp wooden stake just hours before he was found. The medical examiner believed that the cross was burned onto the forehead by someone who heated a metal crucifix and then pressed the scalding hot metal against the skin, similar to the way that livestock are branded. The police are unsure who killed Tracer, but they suspect that a staff member may have been involved. That would explain how someone got into the room that was locked. Another hint a staff member was involved is that none of the weapons or the cross was ever found, and it's more likely that a staff member smuggled them out instead of a patient hiding them or disposing of them, especially the large butcher knife that had been used to decapitate Tracer. Another thing that the police are unsure about is if Tracer was killed because someone actually thought he was a real vampire or if he was murdered in that fashion as an act of revenge or vigilantism. Number 4. The Hospital Fires. On September 12, 1987, in the middle of the night, a fire broke out at the Mulvick home in Wichita, Kansas. Travis, 38, and Sharon, 36, were both killed. Their 12-year-old daughter Karen miraculously survived, but she suffered third-degree burns all over her body, including her head. After hours of skin grafts, she was left terribly disfigured. The whole experience also left her mind in shambles, and she was committed to a psychiatric hospital. In the hospital, Karen would wear a black wig, sunglasses, and wrapped a black scarf around her face. She kept to herself and everyone else seemed to be afraid of her. The doctors and the nurses tried to encourage the other children to talk to Karen, but no one wanted anything to do with her. She quietly ate alone while facing a wall, and then the rest of the time she sat and looked out the window and didn't speak to anyone. After a while, most people stopped noticing that she was even around, even the staff. About 7 months after Karen came to the hospital, there was a fire in the ward. One of the patients, a 16-year-old girl named Patty Fredberg, was killed when her bed inexplicably burst into flames. The fire marshal wasn't able to confirm it, but he thought it was an electrical fire caused by a faulty electric blanket. 2 months later, there was another death caused by a fire in the ward. This time it was in one of the washrooms. It was a 15-year-old girl who wasn't identified, and the best guess the investigator could give was that she set herself on fire as a way to commit suicide. The third fire started in the dining room 2 months after the washroom fire. A 15-year-old girl named Sally Bennett was napping in the lounge when her blanket caught fire, and this led to the girl's pants catching fire. Unfortunately, instead of stopping and rolling, Bennett ran around the lounge, and this made the fire spread. She finally stopped to take the pants off. The hospital staff was able to smother the flames, and Sally was rushed to the emergency room. Since there was so much confusion, no one remembered if Karen was near Sally when the fire started. Amazingly, Sally survived, but her lower half suffered third-degree burns, as did her hands when she tried to get her pants off. She returned to the mental hospital after recovering from her surgeries, and just hours after she returned, the doctors were amazed to find Karen talking for the first time since coming to the hospital. Karen was quietly talking to Sally. They were sitting in the lounge and quietly chatting as if they were old friends. After that, the mysterious fires at the asylum came to an end. No one could prove that Karen was the arsonist, but rumors persist to this day that Karen started them all in the hopes of finding a friend. Number 3. The Missing Nurse. On November 19, 1952, a small fight led to a full-on riot in Ward A at the Danvers State Hospital just south of Boston. It was the most dangerous ward in the hospital because it housed the hospital's most violent offenders. The ward went into lockdown, and that's when the staff realized that one of the nurses, 25-year-old Susan Green, was unaccounted for. The staff was hoping that Green got out before the riot started and simply left work early. But when the hospital staff checked her locker, they saw her street clothes and car keys, so they knew she was locked inside. The police came, and the riot was quelled after 3 hours. The police went into the overcrowded ward to look for the missing 25-year-old nurse, but no trace of her could be found. Every one of the patients were accounted for. However, 3 of the 32 patients in the ward were violently killed during the riot. This made the ward a horrible crime scene because this was 1952 and the police had no idea if any of the blood that covered some of the patients that was splattered around the ward was Green's or the dead patients. When Green disappeared, there were 2 theories as to what happened to her. The first is that she left the hospital before the riot and either chose to disappear or was kidnapped outside the hospital. The second theory is that the inmates killed her and somehow disposed of the body. However, police couldn't find any traces of Green, not even her bones, which would have been impossible for them to dispose of over the course of the riot. The true fate of Nurse Green wasn't discovered until 61 years later when the asylum was being torn down. Construction workers found a cellar room that had been closed off in the last reconstruction. It was an 8x10 windowless room, and inside of it was a human skeleton. In the ceiling of the cellar was a tunnel that led up into Ward A. It's believed that sometime before the riot, the inmates cut out the hardwood floor so that it looked like natural cuts in the wood, and then they somehow bored their way into the cellar below, thinking it was a way to escape. When they did, they realized that the tunnel would not let them escape, but it did give them a secret storage space. A pathologist inspected the bones and determined that they belonged to a woman. What was really disturbing is that Green was 25 when she went missing, and the skeleton belonged to a woman who was at least 32 years old. The pathologist also said that it does not appear that the woman died a violent death. The police were able to track down one of Green's nieces, who gave her DNA. They compared it to the DNA from the skeletal remains, and they confirmed that the skeleton was the missing nurse. Number 2. The Studies. In October 1993, there was a string of prostitutes who disappeared in the San Diego area. Unfortunately, the police didn't put many resources into the disappearances until Sherry Miller, the sister-in-law of an officer of the San Diego Police Department, went missing. When the police investigated the disappearances, they learned that since the beginning of September, there had been at least 12 different sex workers in San Diego who went missing. One witness said that she saw one of the missing women get into a white van with a license plate that started with L68. They traced the van and discovered that it was a work vehicle that belonged to the San Diego County Psychiatric Hospital. When the police asked the hospital for the records of who used the van and to search the premises, they were denied. Due to legal implications, it took 2 days to get the warrant for the records of who used the van. When they looked at the records, they found that each time that one of the women disappeared, the van was being used by the hospital's newest doctor, Jonah Hillcoat. Hillcoat had just recently finished his schooling, and he was a specialist that treated violent psychopaths. Hillcoat also hadn't come to work after the police visited the hospital 2 days prior. When the police went to the address that was listed as his home, they found that it was a small, run-down house that he had been renting. Inside the house, Hillcoat's personal belongings were gone, and based on the dust patterns left behind, the police think that Hillcoat took his large video collection with him. However, they did find one videotape that he left behind in the VCR. It was labeled Study 16. The lead detective, a veteran of 28 years, put the movie back into the VCR and pressed play. The video was dark, as if it was being recorded through a two-way mirror. On the video, there was a large man dressed in a leather apron, torturing a woman whose ankle was chained to a loop on a concrete floor. The detective tried to watch, but he only lasted for a minute. He turned it off when the big man picked up a pair of pruning shears. The hospital was searched, and they found the kill room in the basement. Hillcoat's patients were also interviewed, and 6 of them acknowledged that they were involved in Hillcoat's studies. He supposedly told them that they would be left alone in a room and no one would be watching them. When they walked into the room, the patients would find a woman chained to the floor by her ankle. Also in the room was the apron and a set of torture tools on a table. After killing the woman, they said they didn't know what happened to the body. However, the police believe that Hillcoat burned the remains in the hospital's incinerator and hosed down the room, which had a drain. The police did a quick search and found that Hillcoat still owned property in Minnesota, where he previously resided before starting at the hospital. The Minnesota Police Department went to the property where they found Jonah Hillcoat asleep in his bed with his wife, and he was arrested. At the police station, when they asked him why he would bring women to the hospital for his patients to kill, he said that he had no idea what they were talking about. He claimed that he had never been to California, let alone worked there. When Dr. Hillcoat's picture ran the next morning in the newspapers, the staff at the hospital in San Diego was shocked. The man in the picture was not the Dr. Hillcoat that had worked at the hospital. The police looked into and determined the hospital had hired an imposter who stole Dr. Hillcoat's identity. Unfortunately, since the man who called himself Jonah Hillcoat had a 2-day head start without any police suspicion, he could have easily left the United States without detection. Since they didn't know his name and there was no picture of him, police could only release a sketch of the man who called himself Dr. Hillcoat. There has never been any arrests, and his whereabouts are still unknown. Number 1. Gebhard Fritz's Project. At the end of World War II, Nazi psychotherapist Gebhard Fritz fled Germany and ended up in Recife, Brazil. Once there, he got a job at a mental asylum and he set a lofty goal for himself. He decided he wanted to cure the world of schizophrenia. While that is a respectable ambition, the problem was that while Fritz was no longer in Germany, he still hadn't lost his Nazi ways. In a strange choice, he decided that in order to cure it, he needed to know as much as he could about it. Most importantly, he wanted to know if you could make someone a schizophrenic or if it was merely the chemicals in someone's brain. Fritz would lure people off the street to the hospital with the promise of food and a place to sleep. Then, when he got them to the asylum, he'd lock them in their own isolated cell. Over the next 3 years, he physically and psychologically tortured dozens of people to see if he could make someone schizophrenic. He injected them with different types of poisons. He beat them, performed live amputations, and flayed them, just to name a few of the things he did. If he was able to get a couple or several people from the same family, he would torture them while their loved one watched. Eventually, the torture would get to be too much and his subjects died. Most of the time, a person lasted a week. However, several victims survived for a few months, and one man even endured for almost a year. Over the course of 3 years, Fritz lured at least 42 different people to the asylum. Since so many people were last seen going to the asylum, rumors about Fritz spread around the streets of Recife. On November 16, 1948, while he was out trying to find victims, Fritz was lynched. The crowd beat him before tying him to a pole and setting him on fire. Subscribe for more.